identified as UKS Zoom. So I'll change that. But it's good to be here, and this is going to be like a speed dating session on COVID vaccines. I know everybody's getting ready for the holidays and probably really super busy, but we decided to put this together quickly, just because it's such a prevalent question, and I think there's a lot of concern out there about what to do, what not to do, and so we're going to hopefully end today with answering questions rather than creating more questions. But you can see from this this screen, you got a couple telephone numbers, a couple email addresses. Valerie and I work together here at Updike, Kelly and Spellacy. I'm chair of the Employment Practices Group, and Valerie is an attorney in that group. And we've spent, as you can imagine, the last 10 months answering COVID-related questions and working with our clients and others on COVID-related policies and procedures. So today we have the benefit of really just focusing on one issue, which is what you should be thinking about in terms of mandating the COVID vaccine when and if it's available more generally to employers. So with that, I'll jump in and get us going. We're going to just go for, like I said, it's going to be like a speed dating session. We're going to go for about 20 minutes and then open it up to questions, and hopefully we can get those answered. So with the vaccine, we've just by way of a little bit of background, ever since March of last year and the pandemic and its implications in the workplace, we've seen a general relaxing of a lot of what we call EEOC standards and/or guidance by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, essentially allowing employers a little bit more flexibility about what they can and can't do with respect to employee health. Prior to COVID, it was much more restrictive in terms of whether you had the right to conduct medical exams or make medical inquiries of your employees. But with COVID, the EEOC has relaxed that guidance somewhat, primarily with one real focus in mind, is that an employer generally has the right to set working conditions, especially when it's related to employee health and safety. So if you look back in the EEOC guidance, for example, early on, the EEOC said that it was lawful for an employer to require employees to get tested for COVID-19. We've seen that sort of evolve now, and the main question becomes now whether to mandate or not to mandate the COVID vaccine when it's available. So we can jump to the next slide there, Valerie. So I think that here's the framework that we should be looking at today. The question obviously is should you mandate the vaccine? When thinking about that, the EEOC came out with guidance last week that probably caused more questions than answered them. But the framework to look at it is simply that you can require an employee, your employees to be vaccinated, but there are certain exceptions that apply. The first two exceptions that we'll talk about are exceptions under the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Valerie and I will give a quick explanation on that. However, the exception that you're probably a little bit more interested in talking about is whether, even despite the ADA and Title VII, what do we do with employees who simply don't want to take the vaccine if we require it because they're concerned about its safety or whether it's been adequately vetted and things like that. So we'll get to that. But as I said, based on the guidance that came out recently, the EEOC has basically said that an employer can require vaccinations to be mandatory, but you have to take into consideration two main exceptions, and this is historical. I mean, if you look back at the flu vaccine, the measles vaccine, whatever vaccine we've ever dealt with in the past, it's always been subject to various exceptions. The first exception is under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the second under Title VII. Under the ADA, you can require this, but you have to be able to make an exception or a reasonable accommodation for someone that might have a disability that's contraindicated by the vaccine. So the way that we look at it is the employer has the right. The employer can have a standard that basically says that someone with COVID is a direct threat to themselves and or other people in the workplace, which would allow an employer to mandate the vaccine. But then you have to take into account those that may have a disability. And the way it works with the disability is the way it works with accommodating any disability. You have to go through that interactive process. You have to have the dialogue and individual assessment. We can jump to the next screen there, Valerie. You have to go through that individualized assessment with that employee to determine does that employee cause a direct threat to themselves or to the workforce, and if so, can that direct threat be minimized or eliminated by an accommodation? So it's the same sort of analysis that we go through with normal ADA type accommodations. The thing is that once you've determined, and the EEOC has already come out, and the CDC has already come out and said that COVID-19 poses a direct threat to people in the workplace. So the question is, how do we eliminate that direct threat? Obviously, one way to eliminate it is to require the vaccine, but then you may face situations where employees with disabilities aren't willing to take it or should not take it. So you go through that individualized assessment with them. Is there an accommodation that would lessen or minimize or eliminate the direct threat? If an unvaccinated person in the workplace can come into the workplace and be socially distanced from everybody else, or that person can work remotely, those are reasonable accommodations that would eliminate the direct threat risk, and therefore an employer would be required to pursue that accommodation as opposed to barring someone from the workplace. If, on the other hand, you go through that individualized assessment and there's not a reasonable accommodation that can be made that's not unduly burdensome to the employer, at that point, an employer could prohibit the employee from entering the workplace, but it's still a step away from actually terminating that person because they're unwilling to or unable to get vaccinated. So in the EEOC, and I think we gave a link on a prior slide, the EEOC has come out with some good guidance, but essentially what they're saying now is that you need to go through these steps of assessment. And even when you get to the point where someone is a direct threat, it can't be eliminated by accommodation. You still need to sort of assess whether that person is entitled to other accommodations under other workplace laws. Would they be entitled to unpaid leave? Would they be entitled to, as I said, other types of accommodations prior to actually jumping towards, or towards termination? Okay, so that's sort of the framework. And when we get through the Title VII piece of this, we can talk about some particular questions. But I think the main question that seems to be out there is because of the EEOC guidance, do we have to mandate vaccines? At this point, there's no requirement that you actually have to mandate. It's a may, but if you choose to mandate, then you need to be very careful about going through these steps and accommodating employees with disabilities. This slide just simply talks about the documentation that you're required, and you are required to ask for some level of documentation to support that disability. And we can jump to the next one. So that's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities piece of this. Valerie's going to talk quickly about the Title VII piece of it, and then we're going to come back to that question that I mentioned about, okay, what if it's not ADA? What if it's not Title VII? What if someone just doesn't want to do it? And we'll address that as well.
So as Chris mentioned, one of the two exceptions is Title VII, and Title VII of Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibits employers with at least 15 employees from discriminating against in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And the way this plays out in the context of vaccination is that employers must provide a reasonable accommodation for an employee who does not want to get or can't get vaccinated based on a sincerely held religious belief, unless it would impose an undue burden on the employer to allow such an accommodation. And just as Chris was talking about the standard for the ADA, the standard under Title VII is undue burden, which is less stringent than the ADA. An undue burden is, the EEOC defines that as more than a de minimis or a very small cost or burden on the employer. And another question that comes up in this context is, how do I know if my employee's request is actually for a legitimate religious accommodation? The EEOC has provided guidance that the definition of a religious belief is very broad, and it protects beliefs that may not be obvious or familiar to an employer. So if you should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for religious accommodation is based on something that a sincerely held belief. However, if you can seek additional questioning and get to the bottom of it if you have an objective basis for questioning this belief, if it doesn't seem right to you. And you can ask for documentation to be provided to kind of back this up if you have a legitimate concern about the reason that they're requesting an accommodation. I'm going to talk a little bit about employee resistance, because I'm sure that a lot of us are aware that Americans, many are resistant to getting COVID-19 vaccine based on the information that's been in the media or from talking to other people. And some of the concerns are that, as Chris said, that requiring a vaccine mandate in your workplace, there's some issues. It can lower employee morale, and it can create tensions in the workplace environment. And additionally, we don't know how it's going to be perceived like a broad spectrum across the whole country, but there can be a problem if employees would rather not get a vaccine than to be terminated. And that would cause a huge issue across the whole country if the majority of people didn't want to get the vaccine and they wouldn't care if they were terminated for that decision. There can be litigation that arises, just like with any policy that requires individuals to do something in the workplace, like a vaccine. It can lead to lawsuits, which even if the employer does prevail, it's costly, and again, it lowers employee morale. So Chris will talk a little bit more about this, but there are some ways to create incentives for employees to get the vaccine rather than mandating it across the board. And these have been in the media lately. They've really been pushing these incentives, and I'm sure there'll be more coming out with ideas of how employers can handle this. But we think that some of the more important ones are developing an education campaign or educating your employees on the importance of the vaccine and the successes of the vaccine as this information is available. You can also make obtaining the vaccine very easy for the employees, such as covering any costs that might be associated with receiving it, and providing financial incentives to employees. Employees who do get the vaccine may have to take time off to receive it. And also if you have an adverse reaction, employees may require additional time off. So providing paid time for those reasons could be another incentive for individuals who may be weary about getting it or worried that getting the vaccine may cause them to miss work. Other employers have considered discounts on copays and other health insurance related incentives, considering that the vaccine is seen as assisting employees with their health, and it's kind of a community health issue. So providing those discounts kind of is in the same vein as the vaccine itself. And I think, Chris, you were going to take over just a few issues about state and federal ability to institute a mandate for all employees.
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. Just finishing up here, I know there was some sort of concern about whether the state or the federal government was going to mandate vaccinations. We haven't seen anything that leads us to believe that that would be affected. I mean, obviously the state governments have the right to do that. I mean, if we look back at the measles vaccine or the immunization requirements, for instance, for school-age children, pre-COVID, that was the sort of the topic of the day. And the legislature was, within inches of repealing that legislation, which allowed for a religious exemption from the school immunizations for measles. So there's some precedent for state action on immunizations and vaccines. We have not, at this point, really seen anything coming out that leads us to believe that Governor Lamont is going to take that action. I think it's much more likely that they're going to leave it in the hands of the citizenship, so to speak, and or employers. But there is, obviously there is state power to do that. We don't see either the state or the federal government coming in and mandating the vaccine at this point. Let's just jump to the next one, Valerie. Yeah, and then that's just a slide on the federal authority. But if we go to the last slide, I mean, just to wrap this up and then see if we have any questions. Everybody's sort of, the bottom line here is that if at this point in time, we know that the vaccine, the general availability of the vaccine for the general population, so to speak, is still many months away. Much could change in the meantime. A lot more information could come out in the meantime. But from an employer perspective, that provides employers the opportunity, to spend some time on this and think about what's right for your work culture and for your employees. Depending on your industry, some of you may decide, that something closer to a mandate is required. But that's, our recommendation, for purposes of today and where things stand right now, is, that you look really hard at trying to make this a strongly encouraged practice amongst your employees. Take the time now, between now and then, to educate employees about the benefits, the communal health benefits, the benefits of getting back to work in a safe work environment, and see, how that goes. Ultimately, if an employer decided to mandate it, obviously you'd want to establish a policy for mandating, give your employees, time to understand and sort of consume that. But then also, make sure that you're following the law with respect to the exceptions to that mandate, which would be under the ADA and under Title VII. The bigger issue, I think, actually is going to be those employees that just don't want to take it, as Valerie said, because they're concerned about its safety, or concerned about that there's not enough viable information out there on it yet. And that's going to be a more challenging, and that's where the education comes into play. And you have to take into consideration, if an employer were to mandate the vaccine, and then you get, as Valerie said, a critical mass of employees that say, band together and say, we're not going to take it. What are you going to do then? Do you back off your mandate? Do you fire your employees? It really puts you between a rock and a hard place. So with that, I think, Valerie, unless you have anything else to add, I think we said we'd go for 20 minutes, and that's what we did. Happy to answer some questions I haven't checked the chat room, Diane. I don't know if there are any in there. But also we'll
We're-
make these slides available.
Sure. So we'll send them out to everybody who's registered for this. The question, one question that came up that was sent earlier was, if I do decide to make these mandatory, what is the process I should do with my employees? How do I notify them? Do I have to have a policy? What kinds of things should I establish to best protect myself from future possible litigation?
Right. Yeah. So that if you go in the direction of mandating, I mean, obviously education is key. Educating your employees as to why, giving them an opportunity to sort of respond to that mandate and explain, their point of view. But ultimately, you'd want to establish a policy, in terms of when it's going to be rolled out, when the mandate would go into effect. And I think you would specifically want to reference the fact that you're going to honor those exceptions under the ADA and Title VII. And then the final one, the biggest probably exception is going to be those folks that don't want to take it. And really you have to decide, what your position on that is going to be. Are you going to take a hard line on that if you're not willing to take the vaccine, that's going to lead to a separation of employment? That's not our recommendation. I mean, our recommendation is, even with those folks, although you're not required to provide them with a reasonable accommodation, you'd still want to have that dialogue with them and see, what their thinking is, and whether there's a workaround, so to speak.
Another question I got ahead of time was, if I do mandate the vaccine or even encourage my employees to take it, and somebody has a bad reaction to it or has an allergic reaction to it, am I going to be held liable or responsible for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I mean, I think we can sort of look back and it's sort of the same question. Once, the EEOC has come out and said, pretty clearly that mandating the vaccine under the circumstances that we've discussed doesn't violate, ADA or Title VII. I think it's that same liability that would exist, if someone contracted COVID in the workplace. Perhaps it's a workers' comp liability, but I think that's the concern about mandating, and those are really the unanswered questions. If we mandate it and someone has an adverse reaction, is it more likely that the employer is going to get sued as a result of that? I think the answer to that is probably yes, but I think the liability might be a workers' comp liability more than anything else.
Okay. I don't see any other specific questions to the vaccine. There is another COVID related question if you want to try to hit this one up. If an employee has tested positive and then they quarantined for the 2 weeks, they had symptoms during the first week of their quarantine. Once they're symptom free and have completed their quarantine, can I then require them to retest before they return to work?
Yes.
But
and the quarantine, and Valerie, correct me if I'm wrong on this, the quarantine now has been reduced to 10 days from 14 and 7 from a negative test. I think that's
correct. But the only issue with requiring a retest before they return, I've read on the CDC guidance that you often continue to test positive even after you've recovered. So you can continue to test positive even when you're not contagious anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you got someone, that had a positive test, I think you have the option to have them retest. If they test positive, I think if they've if they've adequately quarantined since their last positive test, I think they could be allowed back into the workplace.
The CDC, I think the message they've been sending is that the lack of symptoms should be looked at as more of an indicator than a negative test after a positive test has been received.
Yeah.
I think it has also to do with what kind of test, because the antigen test, definitely you'll test positive because you'll still have antigens, but the non-antigen test might be more accurate if you can find a place that does either or both. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to
No?
remember now between the two tests, because I think the EOC, I don't know, Valerie, if you remember, the EOC came out saying you could require one, but not the other. I'd have to look back.
Yeah, I can't recall.
I can
That would
shoot
be
you,
very interesting.
yeah, I can shoot a quick email on that.
Okay. And Chris, you said something about it's 10 days now for quarantine, but 7 if they test negative. What does that mean?
So the quarantine now is 10 days from a positive test. If you get a negative test, right, Valerie, is it 7 days from a negative test?
Yes. So that's in the I think that's in the context of when you've had a possible exposure, you come into close contact with someone who's positive. The quarantine's only 7 days if you get a negative test. Or it's 10 days if you do not get a test at all, but you have no symptoms after your close contact.
Another question is if with a travel advisory, if you come back from another country and you did not test before you came back and you haven't tested here, you have to quarantine until you do test and get a negative result. But what happens if you go home and you quarantine from the world, but you're with your family? Do those family members have to be quarantined with you until they all test negative or not?
I think you only have to quarantine when you have been in close contact with a confirmed positive COVID diagnosis.
For the family members?
Right. So, I mean, I don't think there's any. At least I don't think there is, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question that upon returning from travel from a foreign country, if you're
We're
quarantined,
requiring people to quarantine.
yeah,
But if they're quarantining in their home with their family members, is it okay for those family members to go out about their life and go to work and everything else? And because that person hasn't tested negative yet, so they're unknown.
yeah. I'm not sure I can answer that one. It sounds like if they didn't travel to the foreign country.
Right.
No, the family members did not travel.
Yeah.
I think the quarantine's only if you were returning from the actual trip or if you've been in close contact with someone who's confirmed positive.
Positive, yeah. So I think they would be able to go about their business.
If anyone has another question, feel free to put it in chat. Otherwise, I think we have covered this. And I'm sure if we get any updates or things change, we can have you come back and talk. Let's see where the state and the federal government go on this. There's all kinds of talk in the press about passport cards and barcodes and other such things with identifying those who have been vaccinated and not. And if we go in that direction, I'd love to have you guys come back and talk about that.
Yeah, we'd love to come back, and I think things will sort of evolve as they have been over the last 10 months.
So if you were to close out with one final, one sentence to wrap up everything, what is your recommendation or your thoughts on the whole concept of mandating vaccines?
Well, I think it's really timely to be talking about this now while there's still time to sort of sort it out and figure it out. I think our position is right now that the downside of mandating, exceeds the benefits, and you have some flexibility, but I think that it's time to think about how to put in a policy or a program in place where you can get everybody on board voluntarily. I think that just seems like a safer way to go right now than sort of the draconian mandate, which people just don't like.
I want to thank you both for being here. Again, you're from Updike, Kelly, and Spellacy. awesome chamber members. Your information was at the beginning of this, and I'll send those slides out so they'll have it. So the recommendation is you should contact an attorney if you have any questions, and you guys would be great at helping them write their policies if they need that. And again, I'll send out the recording and the slides to everyone. So happy holidays, enjoy the season, and be safe. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.